Boa noite a todas, todos e todes. Nós temos agora uma conferência que vai ser realizada em língua inglesa com a nossa convidada, a professora Ellen. Então, eu vou pedir licença a vocês para passar a falar em inglês, certo? Eu acho, embora eu não tenha certeza, que o YouTube tem uma ferramenta de legenda que vocês podem acionar, que eu acho que ajuda também a gente a acompanhar a conferência, tá bom? Good evening, everyone. We are delighted to receive at our Congress Professor Ellen, one of the main feminist contemporary philosophers. She is liberal arts professor of philosophy and women's gender and sexuality studies, and head of the Department of Philosophy at the Pennsylvania State University. Her researches are focused mainly in continental philosophy of the 19th and the 20th centuries, on critical social theory, on feminist thought, and on psychoanalysis. I would like to mention here some of her books. The Power of Feminist Theory, Domination, Resistance, Solidarity. It was published in 1999. The Politics of Ourselves, Power, Autonomy, and Gender in Contemporary Critical Theory from 2008. The End of Progress, Decolonizing the Normative Foundations of Critical Theory, published in 2016. And her most recent book, Critique on the Couch, Why Critical Theory Needs Psychoanalysis, published last year. Professor Ellen will present us today the 5th chapter of this book with the conference entitled Transference and the Methodology of Critique. These books, I mentioned it, compose a work and a thought that already exerts a great influence on philosophy, critical theory, and psychoanalysis in Brazil and, of course, around the world. Professor Ellen is also editor of Constellations and of the book series New Directions on Critical Theories at Columbia University Press. After her talk, I'll make myself a short intervention in order to open the discussion. The audience can feel free to ask questions or make comments in English or in Portuguese. If you make them in Portuguese, I will try to translate them. And if I can't do it, I will ask my colleagues at the backstage or Google for help. Professor Ellen, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's an honor for us to have you here. I hope you can feel very welcome. Yours.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction and for the invitation to participate in this exciting conference. I only regret that it has to be done virtually. I would really love the chance to meet many of you face to face and have informal conversations. So, but we do the best we can with the limits of this medium. So what I'm going to present is a condensed version of chapter 5 of my book, Critique on the Couch. The book as a whole makes a case for the importance of psychoanalysis for critical theory in the Frankfurt School tradition. So it's in a way responding critically to Habermas's move away from psychoanalysis in the early 1970s, and also responding sympathetically but somewhat critically to Axel Honneth's engagement with psychoanalysis, which I think is a very important intervention. But ultimately, I'm a little dissatisfied with what I see to be his kind of overly sanitized reading of Winnicott as the sort of primary interpretation of psychoanalysis that he offers. And so I take a different approach in this book. And the major figure that I'm engaging with is Melanie Klein. In the early chapters of the book, I argue that Klein's work provides a really important and underutilized resource for critical theory, precisely because she's so attuned to the ambivalence of human relationships and the human psyche. So she starts with Freud's late version of drive theory with the duality of life and death drives, and then she really interprets the drives in what I see as a very distinctive fashion, both accentuating their intrapsychic nature and also the way that they operate intersubjectively. So kind of my reading of Klein is that she's right on the kind of midpoint between the intersubjective and the intrapsychic. And that's really distinctive of her in the field of psychoanalytic theory. But it's also makes her work a really interesting resource for critical theory because it enables critical theory to recuperate a version of drive theory that takes seriously the negativity of the death drive, but that understands that those drives as unfolding within human social relationships rather than as a kind of anti-sociality, if you will. So that's sort of the starting point. Later chapters then explore Klein's notion of ego integration in relationship to the work of Adorno and his critique of integration, and then also discuss what, if any, conception of progress is compatible with the starting point of the kind of reality of the death drive. So those are the chapters that kind of lead up to the one that I'm going to present. I wanted to give you all a little bit of a flavor of the rest of the book, since this chapter that I'm presenting comes near the end. This chapter does, in a way, maybe stand on its own, however, because it takes a different angle on the question of why critical theory needs psychoanalysis. The earlier chapters argue that critical theory needs psychoanalysis because psychoanalysis offers a more ambivalent and realistic philosophical anthropology that helps critical theory kind of get over its excessive rationalism. And then also that psychoanalysis helps critical theory to overcome its tendencies toward progressive and developmentalist forms of thinking. This chapter takes a different approach and argues that critical theory needs psychoanalysis because psychoanalysis provides a powerful model for what it is to do critique. So I'm exploring the analogy between psychoanalysis and the methodology of critique through the lens of the transference. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction, and now I'll proceed with the talk itself. The early members of the Frankfurt School of Critical Social Theory famously turned to psychoanalysis in search of a social psychology that it could explain why the masses chose fascism over communist revolution. Somewhat less well known is their reliance on psychoanalysis for a model of the methodology of critique. Although the idea of modeling critical theory on psychoanalytic method received its most explicit and systematic articulation in Jürgen Habermas's early work, Knowledge and Human Interests, this connection was also central to the work of Theodor Adorno, whose core notion of negative dialectics, with its focus on non-identity and particularity, was at least partly inspired by Adorno's reading of Freud. The corollary of Adorno's insistence on the untruth of identity is that non-identity is the source of truth. If for Adorno the whole is the false, then the converse also holds. Concrete particulars contain important glimmers of truth. Adorno's method consisted of a micrological reading of the seemingly insignificant artifacts of bourgeois culture and philosophy for their unintentional truths, that is, for what they reveal about social reality despite themselves. In this respect, his method drew inspiration from psychoanalysis, with its focus on the parapraxes, slips of the tongue, everyday cases of losing or forgetting, mishearing or misreading something, and so forth, what Adorno, citing Freud, called the dregs of the phenomenal world. Just as the analyst immerses herself in the fragments and gaps of the analysand's speech, assembling them into interpretations that may offer transformative clues to the latter's unconscious, the Adornian critical theorist immerses herself in the blind spots and waste products of history, assembling them into constellations that can strike a spark that lights up social reality in a new and practically transformative way. In his early work, Habermas takes up this analogy between psychoanalysis and the methodology of critical theory, transforming it to cohere with his more rationalistic vision. In Habermas's hands, the conception of psychoanalytic and critical method shifts from the striking constellation of fragments of experience to the motivational power of rational insight. And the deep and arguably intractable problem that plagues Adorno's work, that of doing justice to the non-conceptual, is at least ostensibly solved through the model of communication. However, the Habermasian approach to this analogy rests on a flawed understanding of how psychoanalysis works. A common thread running through psychoanalytic theory, from Freud through Klein to Lacan, is that analysis works, if and when it does work, first and foremost through the transference, not through the power of rational insight. This is not to say that rational insight is completely beside the point. There is an important sense in which psychoanalysis can be said to aim at enhancing and expanding one's own self-understanding. But it is to say that transference is a necessary precondition for such insight to be effective. Thus, any attempt to model critical theory on psychoanalytic method must grapple with the role of transference in the distinctive type of self-transformation that analysis aims to bring about. Although stressing this point might seem to undermine the analogy between psychoanalytic and critical theoretical method, for it is admittedly difficult to see, at least at first glance, what could serve as the analog within critical theory for psychoanalytic transference, I will draw on the work of Jonathan Lear to suggest an interpretation of transference for which this is not the case. However, it does point in the direction of a different understanding of the methodology of critical theory, one that is closer in the end to Adorno's than it is to Habermas's. Okay, so the first section then looks at Habermas's interpretation of psychoanalysis as a model of critique. Habermas interprets psychoanalysis as a science of self-reflection. The Habermasian model understands the psyche in communicative terms, where the unconscious is figured as a force that disrupts the subject's internal self-communication. The job of the analyst on this view is to enhance the subject's self-understanding by helping to restore his broken internal dialogue. Psychoanalysis for Habermas thus aims at a reflective act of self-understanding, specifically of those portions of our experience or life history that have been alienated, split off, or repressed. Its goal is that of making the unconscious conscious by translating it into a communicable language. To be sure, Habermas acknowledges that reflective self-understanding is both a cognitive process of coming to understand the resistances to making the unconscious conscious, and an affective process of dissolving those resistances. And he discusses extensively the role of transference and working through in Freud's account of these processes. Nevertheless, his account of psychoanalysis emphasizes and places conceptual and temporal priority on the role of linguistic interpretation and rational insight in the process of self-reflection. For Habermas, the transformative work of analysis is accomplished through insight, and the analytic relationship is understood in communicative terms as facilitating a process of reflective enlightenment. On the basis of this interpretation of psychoanalysis, Habermas offers an analogous conception of critique as the diagnosis and cure of social pathologies. Like psychoanalysis, critique begins and ends with a felt need for practical change, but it works if and when it does work through the medium of rational insight. Therefore, critique becomes the process of methodical self-reflection applied at the level of the social whole. It is the attempt to restore a broken or distorted internal dialogue within a society by restoring open and free communication with those parts that have been internally split off or repressed. It may be guided by an emancipatory interest, that is, an interest in overcoming social suffering or political domination, and it may, if all goes well, result in practical social and political transformation. But critical power inheres in critical insight, specifically in a process of communicative rational enlightenment. Now, Habermas himself quite famously abandoned this analogy between critique and psychoanalysis not long after the publication of Knowledge and Human Interests in 1968. Around the same time, he also abandoned psychoanalysis altogether, replacing Freud with the cognitive and moral developmental psychology of Jean Piaget and Lawrence Kohlberg, respectively. Recently, however, Habermas's interpretation of the analogy between psychoanalysis and critique has been revived by prominent contemporary critical theorists, including Axel Honneth. It's also, I should mention, been revived in a really interesting way in the work of Robin Selicates, which I do talk about in the book, and I might mention briefly toward the end of my remarks here, but I don't, in the interest of time, I don't go into details about his account in what I'm going to present right now. For Honneth, critical theory is grounded in a moment of negativity, namely the experience of injustice and other forms of social harm and suffering. These forms of suffering are experienced as unjust insofar as they violate legitimate expectations of the social conditions that are necessary for individuals to lead a good life. In such circumstances, Honneth claims that the cause of those negative experiences is understood as a social pathology of reason. The idea of a social pathology of reason necessarily presupposes a conception of intact social rationality, for it is only against the background of such a conception that a pathology of reason can be identified as pathological. And here is where psychoanalysis enters Honneth's picture of the distinctive methodology of Frankfurt School critical theory. Critical theorists on Honneth's account converge on the diagnostic premise that contemporary capitalism represents a deficient or pathological form of social rationality. In addition, they share a view of the proper therapy for this social pathology of reason, a therapy that draws on precisely the very rational potentials that are embedded in modern institutions and practices, but impeded by contemporary capitalism. If critical theory aims to facilitate not just the critique, but also the practical overcoming of social pathologies, then it must, for Honneth, take up the standpoint of the intact social rationality that has been distorted, but not entirely obviated by the social pathology. Modern rationality may be deformed or pathological, but it is not wholly deformed. And moreover, individual subjects are intrinsically motivated to attempt to more fully realize that rationality that is only partially actualized in their current social order. Moreover, the method for overcoming their suffering involves the mobilization of the very same rational capacities that have been impeded by the existing pathology. On Honneth's reading, psychoanalysis rests on an individual interest in rational enlightenment and self-realization that parallels the emancipatory interest that fuels social critique. Thus, psychoanalysis serves as a model for critical theory insofar as the emancipatory aim of each is the achievement of a more rational mode of self-relation or society. This enhanced rationality is understood as the fuller realization of the rational potential that is inherent in both the individual and in the modern social order, but deformed by neurosis in the former case and capitalism in the latter. Moreover, for Honneth, the method for achieving this emancipatory aim in both psychoanalysis and critical theory is the reactivation and mobilization of the very rational powers that have been distorted either by neurosis or by social pathologies of reason. On this view, psychoanalysis and critical theory both work by mobilizing rational reflective insight and processes of critical self-understanding, whereby previously split off components of the personality or the society are integrated into a rational psychic or social whole. Okay, second section then deals more closely with psychoanalytic method. Although these two versions of this analogy between critique and psychoanalysis differ in their details, each rests on a rationalist interpretation of psychoanalytic method. Even as these authors acknowledge to varying degrees that analysis is not merely cognitive, but also affective, motivational, and practical in character, they converge on the assumption that psychoanalysis works primarily through the medium of rational insight or reflection. And it's this assumption that we should pause to consider. This is not to say that there is no textual evidence for a rationalistic reading of Freudian technique. There is undoubtedly a strong rationalistic current running through much of Freud's work, and there are, moreover, versions of psychoanalytic theory and practice that resonate deeply with such a conception of its aims and methods. Nonetheless, the rationalist interpretation of psychoanalytic method is at the very least problematically partial, insofar as it obscures the ultimately rather limited role that Freud's writings on clinical technique gave to rational insight and the corresponding emphasis that he placed on transference. So Freud recognized the limitations of the talking part of the talking cure and the importance of the transference as early as 1910. As he puts it in his paper, Wild Psychoanalysis, quote, "It is a long superseded idea and one derived from superficial appearances that the patient suffers from a sort of ignorance, and that if one removes this ignorance by giving him information, he is bound to recover. The pathological factor is not his ignorance itself, but the root of this ignorance in his inner resistances, end quote. After all, if mere knowledge about the unconscious were as transformative as people sometimes think it is, then reading books about psychoanalysis would suffice to treat neurosis. We all know that doesn't really work. So, but simply reading about psychoanalysis has as much of an impact on the neurotic symptoms as reading a menu has on the starving person's hunger. Moreover, and more problematically, offering the patient insights into his unconscious all too often seems only to make things worse, to exacerbate his inner conflicts. Analysts should, Freud therefore suggests, refrain from offering interpretations until two preconditions are met. First, the analysand has already drawn near to the repressed material, and second, a transference relationship has been established. To be sure, Freud himself was at times guilty of overestimating the effectiveness of insights and interpretations in analysis. As he explains in the important paper, Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through, his thinking about analytic technique went through a series of transformations, from an early reliance on hypnosis to bring about catharsis, to a later emphasis on interpretations to generate insight into the causes of repressions, to a mature focus on the importance of working through the transference relation. On this latter conception of the analytic situation, the analysand does not, as Freud had previously assumed, remember anything about the fact that he has repressed something, much less about the content of that repression. Rather, he repeats what he has forgotten and repressed, but without being aware that he is doing so. Freud offers some memorable examples here. The analysand who has repressed her defiance toward her parents' authority acts defiantly toward the doctor. The one who felt ashamed of his infantile sexuality now feels shame in the face of the analyst and can't offer any productive associations, and so on. As Freud puts it, quote, as long as the patient is in treatment, he cannot escape this compulsion to repeat. And in the end, we understand that this is his way of remembering, end quote. Indeed, the transference relation is itself a kind of repetition, a replaying of dynamics of the affective relationship to the primary caregiver, primarily of love, but also, Freud acknowledges, of hate as well. Psychoanalysis for the mature Freud then provides a context in which the psychic traumas and deficiencies of that primary relationship can be affectively relived and negotiated. Through what Freud calls the handling of the transference, analysis plays with the repetition compulsion, allowing it to expand freely and in so doing rendering it harmless. If the goal is to replace the analysand's actual neurosis with a transference neurosis, which can be dynamically worked through in the context of the analysis, then this process involves something altogether different in character from an analytic knowledge or insight. The key to overcoming resistance is not more or better analytic insight, but rather allowing, quote, the patient time to become more conversant with this resistance, with which he has now become acquainted, to work through it, to overcome it by continuing in defiance of it the analytic work, end quote. So Jonathan Lear highlights this aspect of analytic technique in his masterful overview of Freud's philosophical work. Although Lear characterizes the aim of psychoanalysis as that of, quote, facilitating the development of self-conscious thought in the analysand, end quote, he doubts that rational self-reflection is the proper method for this facilitation. The key to understanding this point lies in how we conceptualize the unconscious. For Lear, the unconscious is best understood not simply as a repository of repressed wishes or instinctual impulses, but rather as he says, a peculiar form of thinking, one that is subject to its own distinctive rules, governed by logics of condensation and displacement, exempt from the principle of non-contradiction, and timeless in character. These features of unconscious thinking enable the development of certain core unconscious fantasies that serve to organize the individual's experiences and that are remarkably impervious to counter-evidence and rational reflection. On Lear's understanding, psychoanalysis aims at enabling the analysand to gain a deep understanding of the structure of the unconscious and to acquire what he calls practical mastery over its fractal nature. For this type of practical mastery, mere rational or cognitive insight is not only insufficient, it also all too easily becomes an impediment, a form of psychic defense that blocks the development of the practical skill of experiencing one's unconscious conflicts as they unfold in the here and now, and learning to intervene in them productively or to work through them. Now, although there are obvious and significant divergences between Freudian, Kleinian, and Lacanian understandings of analytic technique, and although I don't have time to discuss the details of these accounts tonight, these theorists do converge on the claim that psychoanalysis doesn't work if and when it does work through rational insight. So, for example, for Klein, only on the basis of the security of the analytic relationship can analytic insight have any power. For Lacan, if analytic speech, quote, hits home, it does so only on the basis of an established transference. Freud, Lear, Klein, and Lacan all suggest that it is not sufficient to claim, as Habermas and Honneth do, that rational insight or reflection serves as a precondition for affective or motivational transformation, without also acknowledging the reverse, that psychoanalytic power inheres in the dynamic working through of the internal conflicts and repetition compulsions on the terrain of the transference, and that this affectively laden practical process is a necessary condition for the effectiveness of rational insight. Okay, so now turning to the relationship between transference and critique. So what then are the implications of this reading of transference for the analogy between psychoanalysis and critique? Focusing on the role of transference in the analytic relationship might seem to raise a serious problem for this analogy. What, after all, could it possibly mean to say that critique, like psychoanalysis, works through the establishment of a transferential dynamic that enables analytic insight to hit home? Two distinct but not unrelated problems emerge here. First, does this mean that critical theorists should somehow aim to establish an affective bond with the members of social movements with whom they are in partisan, if not uncritical dialogue? And if so, does such a vision not suggest a deeply problematic, not to mention highly implausible, image of the critical theorist as charismatic guru? Second, where does the analyst or critical theorist stand in relation to this transferential dynamic? Does the analogy between psychoanalytical and critical method rest on a problematic, authoritarian, and elitist conception of the analyst, according to which the analyst occupies an objective stance, unaffected by the neurotic and affective disturbances that they aim to diagnose and treat? And if so, then does this imply a similarly authoritarian and elitist conception of the critical theorist who takes up an objective external stance on the social practices, structures, and institutions that she aims to criticize? And is not such a conception of the theorist at odds with critical theory's commitment to immanent critique? So to address the first worry, I want to return to Lear, who helpfully distinguishes between two conceptions of transference in Freud's work. In Freud's original conception, transference refers to the process of transferring an emotion or an affective state from one object to another. On this view, a transference relation is established within the analysis when the analysand transfers their feelings for their primary object to the person of the analyst. Here, the analysand's interpersonal world is taken to be more or less fixed or given, and what is transferred is simply the attachment to their primary object. In Freud's later work, however, Lear discerns a new conception of transference, one in which the structure of the analysand's interpersonal world is no longer taken for granted, but instead becomes the primary focus. On this view, transference is not merely the transferring of feelings from one object to another. Rather, it is what Lear calls the repetition of an entire orientation to the world, or, as he also puts it, an idiosyncratic world coming into view in the analytic situation. Through the establishment of the transference in the analytic situation, analysands come to realize that the world that they have up to now experienced as a given independent reality is actually a structure of experience that they have had a hand in creating. And through this realization, their world begins to open up for transformation. Now, although neither Klein nor Lacan refers explicitly to Lear's distinction between relational and structural conceptions of transference, I think both of them seem to adopt something closer to the latter than the former. Klein contends that transference concerns not just the one-to-one relationship between analyst and analysand, but a more complex situation that represents the analysand's entire world of internal and external object relations. Similarly, Lacan insists that we must be careful not to reduce transference to the analysand's feelings for the analyst, for to do so is to remain at the level of the imaginary. Instead, he writes, we must begin with the fact that transference in the final analysis is repetition compulsion. Situated at the level of the symbolic, transference is a spontaneous construction of the past within the present that is accessible to interpretation and directed to the other. Transference is best understood as the repetition within the analysis of the distinctive track of the analysand's desire, with the analyst standing in for the desire's distinctive object. So I'm obviously moving really quickly here, but in the book I go into more detail about Klein and Lacan's understandings of transference. I mean, the point is, I mentioned earlier that I'm trying to draw on Klein primarily as a resource, but I also am interested in tracing a kind of strand of psychoanalytic theory from what you might call the unofficial Freud or the late Freud through Klein to Lacan. And so that's why I keep coming back to, this triptych of Freud, Klein, and Lacan here. I realize I'm moving really quickly, but it's just in the interest of time, and there's a bit more detail in the chapter itself. Okay, so reading the discussion of transference offered a moment ago through the lens of Lear's distinction helps to show why the first worry that I laid out a few minutes ago is misplaced. If we understand transference as bringing into view the analysand's distinctive and idiosyncratic way of experiencing the world, for Klein, the structure of their object relations, for Lacan, the distinctive idiosyncratic track of their desire, and revealing that way to be contingent, thereby opening it up to transformation, then we are no longer subject to the danger of positioning the critical theorist by analogy as a charismatic figure to whom social movement actors need to become affectively attached. Instead, to establish something like a transference relationship in the context of critical theory would mean simply to bring into view, through the interaction between critical theorists and social actors, the actor's distinctive idiosyncratic way of experiencing the world as precisely that, a way of experiencing the world that they themselves have had a hand in constituting. Doing so thus opens this structure of experience up to practical transformation. So by suggesting a new way of understanding the analogy between psychoanalysis and critique, the structural conception of transference also then points, I think, to a distinctive genealogical conception of critique. Indeed, for anyone with even a basic knowledge of Michel Foucault's work, the above description of transference probably already sounds somewhat familiar. Like transference understood on the structural conception, Foucault's critical method aims to reveal an idiosyncratic, historically specific way of ordering things or structuring the world as contingent and made up by a set of complex social practices, thereby opening that mode of experience up to the possibility of practical transformation. To be sure, Foucault never developed the analogy between psychoanalysis and the methodology of critique in a systematic way, and some people might think that because Foucault was in some ways so critical of psychoanalysis that this is like a very strange connection to make. Nevertheless, particularly in his early work, Foucault actually embraced an analogy between psychoanalysis and his archaeological method, suggesting that his critical historical method aims to disrupt the presumptions of continuity, unity, and progressive self-realization that underlie traditional views of history in much the same way that psychoanalysis disrupts the traditional philosophical conception of subjectivity. So although this analogy is no longer referenced explicitly in Foucault's middle and later work, I don't think it's entirely misplaced either. Throughout the various articulations of his method, Foucault's distinctive aim is to bring awareness to those unconscious aspects of experience that structure our current ways of interpreting the world, to reveal them as contingent ways of ordering things that have been constituted through specific historical processes, and in so doing to open them up to practical transformation. However, this attempt to develop the analogy between psychoanalysis and critique by connecting the structural conception of transference to genealogical critique might seem to heighten the second concern that I raised a moment ago about the role of the analyst or critical theorist in the transferential dynamic. After all, although Foucault is not unique in criticizing psychoanalysis for its authoritarian conception of the analyst, he does offer a particularly powerful version of the claim that psychoanalytic method rests on a hierarchical authoritarian relationship between analyst and analysand that trades on the putative moral authority of the analyst, who is taken to be both the representative and the arbiter of normality. Although Foucault's broader argument in The History of Madness credits Freud with attempting to reinstate the dialogue with unreason that had been broken off by positivist psychiatry, and for this reason we must, as Derrida famously insisted, do justice to Freud, in the end he maintains that Freud reinscribed the power-structured characteristic of the asylum, silence, the gaze, and moral judgment, within the doctor-patient relationship, specifically within the transference relationship itself, which he refers to as, quote, the mirror in which madness falls in and out of love with itself. However, this worry is easily dispelled, I think, by paying greater attention to the dynamics of transference. Although the concept of countertransference is never systematically developed in Freud's own work, indeed, he seemed to understand it primarily as an obstacle to be overcome, it has become a prominent theme in post-Freudian psychoanalysis. Similarly, although Klein says very little about countertransference in her published writings, and she seems to understand it mostly as a hindrance to analytic work, later Kleinians and post-Kleinians have made countertransference central to their understanding of analytic technique. And it was actually a Kleinian, Paula Hyman, who published one of the early papers, really influential papers on countertransference in, I think, 1953. Finally, although Lacan is critical of the notion of countertransference, his criticism aims at overly simplistic models that emphasize the analyst's feelings. Despite this critique, to the extent that the structure of the analysand's desire is being repeated in the analytic situation, the analyst is always already involved in that structure. Okay, so the point is that these developments in terms of the theorization and practice of countertransference provide psychoanalysis with a compelling response to Foucault's critique of the authoritarian nature of the analytic relationship. With the concept of countertransference, the analyst's own unconscious and affective responses to the analysand become as much at issue in the analysis as the transference. This, in turn, has the effect of undermining the very distinction between the so-called normal, healthy doctor and the sick patient, on which the authoritarian image of the analyst, so trenchantly criticized by Foucault, rests. Thus, if critical theory is to be understood on the model of psychoanalysis, this need not imply that the theorist is positioned as an external authority who claims to have objective knowledge of the social practices and institutions that she criticizes. Taking seriously the way that the analyst is necessarily implicated in the transferential relationship suggests by analogy a view of the theorist as an engaged participant in ongoing social and political struggles. This is where Robin Selicates' work, I think, is really excellent. Just as for Lacan, what the analyst has to offer is, quote, nothing other than his desire, with the difference that it is experienced desire, end quote. What the critical theorist has to offer is nothing other than the experience of having undergone a change in their relationship to the social world, having come to understand that world as in large part a contingent construction that is open to internal transformation. Okay, so I come now to my last section, which is called Philosophy as an Interpretation. Philosophy as Interpretation. So in light of the preceding argument about the role of transference in analytic interpretation, what role, if any, remains for rational insight in this process and analogously in critical theory? Does my argument suggest that rational insight is irrelevant or beside the point? If not, then how does it relate to the work of the transference? And how can the role of insight be preserved without falling back into the rationalistic interpretation of psychoanalysis that I criticized above? Habermas claims that critique is impelled by a passion for critique. That is, that individuals are motivated to engage in critique because of their suffering, which provides them with a passion for or practical interest in emancipation. If we take seriously the idea that transference is a necessary precondition for analytic insight to hit home, this suggests a more complex sense in which critique might be related to a passion for critique, namely that critique can't possibly be effective unless the way has been affectively prepared for it. The implication of this would be that insofar as critical theory is understood solely as a project of generating and deploying rational insights, it is not only insufficient for motivating emancipatory political praxis, a point that would be difficult to dispute, but that it may actually be counterproductive. In other words, the critical project of offering rational interpretations of social pathologies may serve either to deepen a society's resistances to the contents of those insights, or to mobilize a society's internal defense mechanisms, to allow it to claim to have overcome its pathologies through rational insight and understanding while clinging to them all the more fervently. This is not, of course, to say that critical theory is responsible for the social suffering and pathologies that it attempts to diagnose. Only that insofar as critical theory works solely through the mechanism of rational insight, it might become a surface-level defense mechanism that enables social pathologies to remain rooted at a deeper affective and practical level. So does this mean that critical theory must abandon the goal of offering rational insights into social problems? Not at all. Recall that the line of criticism that I developed earlier does not contend that rational insight or interpretation is irrelevant for the work of psychoanalysis, just that it can only be effective when the way has been prepared for it by working through the transference. Therefore, keeping the analogy between psychoanalysis and the methodology of critique firmly in view, the question is this: how can the rational aspect of critique be understood differently, in a way that coheres with the critical genealogical analog of the conception of transference that I discussed earlier? What model of critique preserves the power of rational insight while avoiding the potential pitfalls of a purely rationalistic model that downplays or misunderstands the passion for critique? So I'd like to suggest in closing that the outlines of such a conception can be found in Adorno's early programmatic essay, The Actuality of Philosophy. Here, Adorno advocates a conception of philosophy as interpretation that is modeled implicitly and explicitly on psychoanalysis, one that provides a compelling alternative to the rationalistic interpretation offered by Habermas, and that, I think, coheres well with the critical genealogical analog of transference that I developed earlier. Distinguishing his account from philosophical hermeneutics, Adorno insists that interpretation does not decipher the meaning that lies behind perceptible reality. To find a meaning in reality is to justify it, and this is decidedly not the goal of interpretation as Adorno understands it. On his view, reality as such has no reason and thus no meaning. It is not produced intentionally. The task of philosophy as interpretation is, therefore, to interpret unintentional reality. The method for interpreting unintentional reality is the construction of what Adorno calls constellations, trial combinations of the minute fragments of experience. That, he says, quote, fall into a figure which can be read as an answer, while at the same time the question disappears, end quote. Just as Freud turned to what Adorno calls the dregs of the phenomenal world for the construction of psychoanalytic interpretations, Adorno turns to the small and unintentional elements of our social experience for the construction of constellations. Just as psychoanalytic interpretation, when offered under the right conditions and at the right time, can light up the analysand's idiosyncratic world of object relations or structure of desire in a new way, enabling the analysand to practically transform those structures, philosophical interpretation can light up social reality in a new and strikingly conclusive way, thus enabling its transformation. So recall Jonathan Lear's claim that I discussed earlier, that the aim of psychoanalysis is to enable the analysand to acquire practical mastery over the fractal nature of psychic life. The fractal nature of psychic life, I take it, refers to the ways in which deep and intricate psychic patterns are unconsciously repeated across different scales of our experience, giving a coherent, if deeply implicit, structure to events that might otherwise appear chaotic and random. By experiencing the emergence of their unconscious conflicts in the context of analysis through the transference, the analysand comes to experience the fractal nature of those conflicts and is able to develop the practical cognitive skill required to intervene in them in productive and satisfying ways. In this context, Lear describes a good psychoanalytic interpretation as, quote, simply a form of words that accurately grasps those conflicts at the right level for the analysand to make a conscious, efficacious intervention in her own thinking and acting, and thereby augments this practical skill, end quote. For Adorno, social experience, too, has a fractal nature. Although he is highly critical of totalizing philosophical systems, on the grounds that such systems fail to take seriously the deep and pervasive irrationality of the real, and thus mirror the totalitarian logic of identity thinking by attempting to subsume all particulars within themselves, his turn to the unintentional fragments of subjective experience that are left in the wake of the decay of such systems does not leave the question of the social totality behind altogether. For Adorno, these fragments contain within them keys to interpreting the social totality. Like Leibnizian monads, they hold up a windowless mirror to the contradictory nature of social reality. As such, these fragmented particulars provide a point of entry into that contradictory reality that cannot be found through systematic philosophy. So philosophy as interpretation assembles the small, unintentional fragments of subjective experience, what we might call the dregs of the concept, into trial combinations, constellations, that light up social reality in a new way. The focus on fragments is necessitated by the failure of systematic philosophy, which Adorno says is incapable of reading the incomplete, contradictory, and fragmentary text of social reality. And yet, because of the fractal nature of social reality, the way that its contradictory, antagonistic, oppressive patterns are repeated across multiple scales, the assembly of fragments into constellations yields a new perspective on the contradictory whole, inducing a transformative effect. Like a good psychoanalytic interpretation, a good philosophical interpretation illuminates the contradictory, antagonistic structure of social reality in such a way that enables social actors to make an effective intervention in their own ways of thinking and acting. So finally, what relationship, if any, does this Adornian conception of philosophy as interpretation have to do with the Foucauldian account of genealogical critique that I discussed earlier? My suggestion is simply that Foucauldian genealogy and Adornian critique might fit together as interconnected parts of a broader critical methodology that takes the analogy with psychoanalysis seriously, while at the same time reading psychoanalysis less rationalistically than Habermas and post-Habermasian critical theorists have done. Genealogical critique brings an idiosyncratic, contingently structured social world into view in such a way that opens that world up to practical transformation. Philosophy as interpretation provides a form of words that, by revealing the contradictory and incoherent yet fractal quality of social experience, lights up social conflicts or problems in a new way, enabling social actors to make conscious, effective transformations in their modes of thinking and acting. Together, they provide the backbone of a critical methodology that is rational without being rationalistic, attuned to the ambivalences and contradictions of social reality, and oriented to practical transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ellen, for this great talk. We are very sorry we couldn't provide a translation. Então, pessoal, estou falando para a audiência que, né, estou me desculpando em nome da comissão organizadora por não termos conseguido providenciar a tradução. Well, as I told at the beginning, I will make a short intervention before handing over the floor. Yeah. Professor Ellen, your most recent book, Critique on the Couch, brings a complex and very original proposal to deal with this relationship, with this interlocution between psychoanalysis and critical theory. You do this based on interesting and careful readings about important points in this debate, as were and are the proposals of Habermas, Honneth, Selikatz, and Adorno. Well, I am aware that you dedicated another chapter of your book to civilization and its discontents. It is the chapter 3, Beyond Developmentalism, Psychoanalysis, and the Critique of Progress. But I take this reference to suggest that, in a way, your arguments in the first chapter can be seen as arguments that address a specific point of this 1930 book at its very end. It is a passage that inspires my intervention here, in that I will then ask permission to quote. I will share the quote as a slide in here so that you can follow me as I read it. Carolina, por favor, você pode compartilhar? So Freud writes the following, I quote, "If the development of civilization so much resembles that of the individual and operates with the same means, is one not entitled to prefer the diagnosis that some civilizations of cultural epochs, possibly the whole of humanity, have become neurotic under the influence of cultural strivings? The analytic dissection of these neuroses might be followed up by suggestions for therapy that would merit great interest. I could not say that such an attempt to apply psychoanalysis to a cultural community would be absurd or doomed to futility, but one would have to be very cautious, remembering that one was dealing only with analogies, and that with concepts as with human beings, it is dangerous to wrench them out of the sphere in which they originated and have evolved. Moreover, the diagnosis of communal neurosis comes up against a special difficulty. In the individual neurosis, the first clue we have is the contrast between the patient and his supposedly normal environment. When it comes to a mass of individuals, all affected by the same condition, no such background is present. It would have to be borrowed from elsewhere. And as for the therapeutic application of the knowledge one obtained, of what use would even the most opposed analysis of a social neurosis be, if no one had the authority to force the mass to undergo treatment? End of quote. Professor Allen, your talk is very, very much thought-provoking, and there are so many points about it that interest me that it was difficult, after reading your chapter, to select 2 or 3 points to bring here to our debate and take the opportunity to hear from you a little bit more. So, considering this need for selection, I choose to raise, in light of the inspiration I sought in this passage from Freud, a question that comes from psychoanalysis territory and a question that comes from critical theory. The first question would concern the handling of the transference. The difficulties highlighted by Freud in this passage I quote make me think especially about the fact that the use of transference as a method in psychoanalytic technique seems to presuppose free association on the part of the analysant. So it would seem important to deal here, based on what you propose about transference, with one of the following alternatives. First one, what would occupy this place of free association in the case of social critique? Second one, it's really alternative. What would be the possibility of dealing with a notion of transference that did not depend on free association? Furthermore, this points to the fact that the analyst invested, even if in the register of fantasy by a specific authority, intervenes and interprets based on a diagnosis or on a diagnosis hypothesis. Psychoanalytic interventions do not go in the same directions when what appears is a picture of hysteria or obsessional neurosis, for example, and this reverberates in the transference neurosis that needs to be engendered in the treatment. So as much as Freud opened the way for us to talk about cultural neurosis, what could be done with this question about the diagnostic hypothesis that seems to be inevitably raised in the analogy of method between psychoanalysis and critical theory? Wouldn't we have elements here that signal to important difficulties in this approximation between psychoanalysis and critical theory through the way of transference? Well, the second question, which I now ask from the perspective of critical theory, would be the following. To what extent does the idea of emancipation imply an idea of justice and an understanding of the political dimension of intersubjective relations? And to what extent these ideas transcend the scope of what is thinkable through psychoanalysis, and even more perhaps through the scope of the psychoanalytic concept of transference? Emancipation seems to imply that the rational can be real. And this, by its turn, seems to be something that, after all, would dissolve the very possibility of psychoanalysis, and especially transference, because it would risk dissolving the very idea of the unconscious. I wonder if this strong idea of emancipation is not what structures, for example, the distance Habermas takes from Freud after knowledge and interest. Of course, when we refer to emancipation, we are referring to an ideal, which in critical theory needs to be situated in an immanent and not utopian way. It is also clear that psychoanalysis offers important tools for dealing with this problem. But given this tension between emancipation and the unconscious, could you please explore further what you think of as this possibility of bringing a social approach to emancipation closer to the psychoanalytic notion of transference? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Leah, for those really excellent questions. And even though you sent them to me a little bit in advance, I confess I don't have answers to all of them, but I do have some thoughts, and I would love to hear, to just have a conversation about some of these issues, which are really important. I mean, obviously, yes, I think there are disanalogies, and we have to be really careful, with trying to sort of map neatly the individual psychic, psychoanalytic context to the social context and so on. And I don't go into those really in the book. So I think this is all fair game. I just find it so striking. I mean, I think one thing that really inspired me in writing this chapter, because here's a confession, I had written a version of it probably 5 years ago. Actually, it was published in Constellations in 2016. And, where I had the kind of critique of Habermas and Hahn it all worked out. And like the problem with their reading of psychoanalysis is that it rests on this misunderstanding of how psychoanalysis works. And so then if we want to hold on to this analogy between psychoanalytic and critical method, which by the way, isn't only there in the Frankfurt School tradition, sort of one can find it in other, strands of critical theory, for example, in Frantz Fanon's work and elsewhere. So if we want to hang on to this analogy, then we have to rethink it through the transference. And then I kind of stopped because I didn't know what to do. I mean, I just thought, I don't know what to do with that. And so what I got really inspired in working on this chapter when I read Lear's chapter or discussion of transference in his book on Freud, because when I read his account of structural transference, I was just like, oh, that's just genealogical critique. Like that's that's a great description of what it is and how it's supposed to work, you know, and the point of it and everything. And so, I think it's important to be attentive to the disanalogies and so on. But I think, to me, the kind of powerfulness of the analogy really struck me when I read his account of the structural conception of transference. Okay, so to actually try to address your questions, I think I'll take them in reverse order, because I feel like I feel slightly more confident about my answers to them in reverse order. So on emancipation, I mean, so I agree that if one thought of emancipation as the kind of convergence of the rational and the real, then that would be totally incompatible with the psychoanalytic framework. So that's not my understanding of emancipation. And I talk about this, I think it's more in chapter 4 of the book. So I try to develop what I call a negativistic and realistic conception of emancipation. So it's negativistic in that the aim of the work of emancipation is about minimizing or transforming relations of domination. It's not about striving to achieve some sort of positive utopian ideal. And it's realistic in the sense that there's an understanding that that's an ongoing, never-ending process, because there's no possibility of the kind of final convergence of the rational and the real, to use that way of thinking about it. So, so I think that way of understanding of emancipation, which I call, I mean, somewhat misleadingly, but I'm kind of stuck with it now, emancipation without utopia, is more compatible with a psychoanalytic framework. And there I would say, I mean, the way that I'm understanding transference, I guess, is it's something like a mechanism that helps bring about the possibility of emancipation, where, you know, the state that one is kind of trying to achieve, it is a kind of ideal, but it's one that's understood negativistically in the psychoanalytic case as a kind of enhanced freedom that is in response to an experience of being stuck. And then in the social case, it's an enhanced freedom that is an unraveling or an opening up of relations of domination. So I'm trying to think less about a trajectory from pathology to cure, and more about a trajectory from a kind of stuckness in or ossification, let's say, of one's experience or of social relations to what Foucault might have called or did call the undefined work of freedom. That's the way that I'm thinking about emancipation. So now that kind of takes me then to the second question that you posed about, don't there have to be some sort of diagnostic hypotheses that are at play in the transference dynamic, and what would the analog for that be in critical theory? I mean, so the first thing I want to say is, even though I think I didn't make this clear in what I presented tonight, and I tended, because I'm, talking about Habermas and Honneth, to use this language of social pathologies and so on, I actually really don't like this way of talking. And so the chapter that precedes this one in the book is called what is it called? I think this title is "The Cure is that there is no cure," and then the subtitle is "Psychoanalysis and the Idea of Progress." So I'm really interested, like I said, in moving away from this kind of notion of pathology to cure, and instead thinking in terms of opening up possibilities, enhancing freedom, and so forth, which I think is less pathologizing kind of language. But that doesn't really get at your question. I mean, I think the answer that I would want to give to your question would be that one would need to think a lot more about the role of social movements in this process. And I only allude to it briefly in the chapter, but I think that what you'd have to think about is the way that certain kinds of diagnoses of problems, or like awareness of problematic issues come up in social movements, and then that serves as a then the critical theorist is kind of in dialogue with the social movement actors in a way that one could see as kind of analogous to the analyst-analysand relationship. And this is where in the book, I think it comes out more clearly in my discussion of Robin Selicates' work, because he's really good on talking about, how this analogy plays out when you start thinking about the kind of diagnostic critique that emerges within social movements. Okay, and then that leaves me with the point about free association, which that's the one I'm least confident in what to say about it. I mean, I guess I would be tempted to say that one might think here about the role of the imaginary and imagination. I don't mean imaginary in the Lacanian sense. I mean it in the more everyday sense, or the imagination in shifting our awareness of social problems, our, shifting our engagement with certain social and political issues, opening up new forms of experience and so on. That might be, so one could look at certain types of aesthetic experience, at film, and so on, as sites where this kind of free association like experience is happening, that then provide, resources for the actors in social movements and critical theorists, both, who are sort of thinking through how to unravel existing relations of domination. So I'm thinking a lot about a really great book by a Mexican critical theorist, Maria Pialara, called Beyond the Public Sphere, Film and the Feminist Imaginary, which is all about how looking at film as a mechanism for transforming social imaginaries in a way that feeds into then political transformation, that serves as a resource for political struggles. So I don't think that's a full answer to the question, especially to your first and second questions, but at least maybe suggests a direction that I think one might go to think further about them.
Yeah, thank you very much for your answers, Professor Allen. I would just say, well, let's think. I would take the opportunity to mention a Brazilian great philosopher whose name is Lélia Gonzalez, and she wrote this great essay entitled Racism and Sexism in Brazilian Culture. And I've got the hint that maybe in that kind of proceeding, we could get some inspiration for advancing this kind of arguments. Yeah, so Professor Allen, we happen to have a researcher on your work attending this Congress. It is Paula Heck, who is currently developing a post-graduation research at Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, with focus on your debate with Robin Selicates. And she is especially interested, as I've just been told, in this chapter of Critique on the Cult on Transference. Paula would like to address Professor Allen some elaborated questions that would not really fit YouTube chat length restrictions. So we invited her to join us here at the room. Paula, be very welcome and feel free to ask your question.
Thank you very much, Prof. Leia. Before I pose my questions, I'd like to thank Prof. Allen for the excellent conference. It's a great pleasure to hear you tonight. Your work have been very important to my philosophical research, especially your latest work, Critique on the Cult, as I have been studying the controversy between you and Robin Selicates over the interpretation of the Habermasian work, knowledge and human interests. I would like to pose 3 questions to you tonight. But first, let me give you a brief background of my concerns. In your book, Critique on the Couch, you wrote that Habermas in Knowledge and Human Interests read psychoanalysis as a science of methodical self-reflection. You said that on his interpretation, psychoanalysis is a form of deep hermeneutics that aims to analyze those aspects of the self that have been alienated from the self and yet, in some sense, remain a part of it. And it refers to what Freud once called the internal foreign territory of the unconscious. As we know, Habermas, in his early work, understands the individual psyche in communicative terms and also the unconscious wishes that have been excluded from the public communication, but that continue to disrupt the subject's internal self-communication in the form of dreams and other interruptions. Therefore, psychoanalysis for Habermas aims at a reflective act of self-understanding, specifically of those parts of our life history that have been alienated or repressed. Its goal is that of making the unconscious conscious by translating it into a communicable language. And then you said that Habermas leaves behind the affective dimension impregnated in intersocial relations. And you also said that from the moment that Habermas focused on the intelligibility of symbolic content and the recomposition of distorted communicative relationships, he solidifies an unilaterally renationalist psychoanalysis interpretation and leaves behind the affective dimension impregnated in the blogs to the subject experience, as well as its importance in the liberation of creative potentials, both in reworking individual understanding and in the rearticulation of society's institutional structure. But through the way I have been interpreting Habermas, it seems to me that he somehow addresses the affective dimension of intersocial relations. I understand that Habermas, when he is referring to social institutions with pathological forms and to what they cause to the psychic dimension of people in our society, he embraces his perspective, in his respective perspective, the affective dimension that exists there. So I would like to know what you think about it. Do you agree with this point of view? And in relation to Habermas' exacerbated rationalism, I understand your point of view and your objections to him, but on the other hand, I understand that it is important and necessary to use reason in order to retake the internal foreign territory and make the unconscious again accessible to the conscious. So how can we make the unconscious accessible to conscious if not through the use of reason? And finally, the third question refers to the Robin Silicate's work, Critical Sociale Praxis. In this work, Silicate defends the Habermasian project found in knowledge and human interests as capable of avoiding a sociological objectivism that ignores the agent's self-understanding as well as the limits of a hermeneutic perspective concerned strictly with the endowment of meaning between socially inserted agents, without asking about their possible failures or social constraints. Based on Habermas' work, Seligman defends a model of criticism as a dialogue between theorists and participants, in such a way that the analysis of pathological social structures, which prevent the full development of the reflexive capacities of social agents, can contribute to immanent practice of your overcoming. So, I would like, if possible, to hear more about you, what you think about these issues, and why you possibly disagree with Selicate's view based on Habermas' work, which defends a model of criticism as a dialogue between theorists and participants. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your questions, and that was really great. So there's a lot probably to say, but I will try to be succinct. I mean, so the first question about to what extent Habermas does address the affective dimension of social relationships. I mean, I don't know that I was intending to deny that he does, or to say that he doesn't have any account of the affective dimension of social relationships. I mean, I don't know that I think that's an emphasis in his work, but I'm not necessarily suggesting that there's no account. And even in his reading of Freud, I mean, it's complicated because he does spend a lot of time talking about Freud's papers on analytic technique. And Habermas is a careful reader. So, even there, I think he's attuned to the fact that there's an affective, if you will, or a dynamic aspect of psychoanalysis. It's not just rational. So my criticism actually is, I think, has a little bit more of a fine point on it. I mean, the point is that he gets the kind of relationship between the rational and the affective backwards, I guess would be the easiest way to put it. So for him, you have, psychoanalysis is this process of incorporating of unconscious content or whatever through the mechanism of rational insight. And that, that what you have is a kind of affective sense that something is wrong, a practical suffering that brings someone into analysis. And then you have this process of kind of rational insight and making the unconscious conscious through this rational dialogue. And then that issues in a kind of motivational or affective transformation. And I'm trying to suggest that actually, in order for the rational insight to be effective in psychoanalysis, there has to be an affective transformation first. There has to be the establishment of the transference. And so it's not so much about whether he acknowledges the importance of affect, but, where the priority is placed, and what is thought to really be doing the transformative work. So that's with respect to the first point. The second point, so it's important, you say it's important to use reason to recuperate the internal foreign territory, and how are we to make the unconscious conscious, if not through the use of reason? I mean, I think I tried to address this worry in the last section of this chapter, the one on philosophy as interpretation. So what I'm saying there is that my claim is not that rational insight is beside the point, that one has to that there is a role for rational insight, I think, in psychoanalysis and in critical theory. But again, it's a question of how it relates to this more affective, motivational kind of transformation. And yeah, I mean, I think this is an extremely complicated question in Freud too, so, Freud has his more rationalistic moments and his less rationalistic moments. And I think, although I'm not trying to say that rational insight is beside the point, I do think we have to be attentive to the way that it can be an impediment to the kind of transformation we're hoping to achieve. And I think that's very clear in the psychoanalytic case. It's maybe more provocative to say it in the case of critical theory, but I don't think it's completely, a completely crazy thing to say, that we ought to be attentive to the fact that rational critique might be serving in some circumstances as a kind of social defense mechanism that enables conflicts to just stay very deeply rooted. So I'm not anti-reason. I'm trying to think about how rational insight relates to this kind of transferential model of critique and how the two might work together to bring about transformation. And then the last question about Robin Salicates' work. So yes, I think Robin is right that that Habermas's account of the dialogue between the critical theorist and social movement actors, that's modeled on psychoanalysis, is really helpful for avoiding the kind of objectivism, I lean, I think, pretty heavily on Robin's work in responding to the concern that, psychoanalysis, if we take psychoanalysis as a model of critique, we're taking on board this idea of the authoritarian analyst that is, that takes up an objective stance outside of the problems that he or she is criticizing. I think Robin's absolutely right that the Habermasian model helps us get past that problem. So in that sense, I agree with him. Really my only disagreement with Salicates' work, and it's maybe a bit of a quibble, is that I think he takes on board a little bit too uncritically this rationalistic reading of that relationship and that dialogue. And I'm trying to think about it differently. I just think, again, you could think about it as sort of conditionally, like if you wanted to try to understand psychoanalysis or to understand critical theory on a model with psychoanalysis, then I think this is just a problem that one has to confront, because I think it's a very unsatisfying interpretation of psychoanalysis to say, that it's all about reason and rational insight. I'm not saying that there's, not a strand of that in Freud's work. There certainly is. There's, like I said, Freud has his very rationalistic moments. But there's just so much in Freud's work and so much in psychoanalytic theory and practice that goes beyond that idea. And so if we want to take on board this analogy, then I think we have to figure out what to do, how to get beyond that kind of rationalistic reading. So I think my criticism of Salicates is much more minor. Like my difference from him is much smaller than it is, let's say, from Honneth or from Habermas. And maybe one could even say that what I'm trying to do is to say to Salicates, yes, and yes to all of that. And we also need to try to think about this dialogue in a slightly less rationalistic terms and what happens if we do that.
Yeah, we have a last question that comes from, let's see, Milena Moravillo. She says, after Freud's conceptions about transference in psychoanalysis, which you said wasn't enough explored, in which post-Freudian author did you find a really fresh and a new approach on transference?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if I don't know that I meant to say that transference wasn't enough explored. I did say that countertransference is really not a topic that's explored a lot in Freud's work, and that's, I think, an account. That's a conception that I think becomes much more prominent in post-Freudian psychoanalysis. And there, I mean, I think the work of not of Klein herself, but of the Kleinian school is really interesting and important. So I mentioned Paula Hyman, who has one of the early papers on countertransference that's really, really groundbreaking. But I'm also thinking about people, I don't know if he would characterize himself as a Kleinian, but people like Thomas Ogden, who I think is really interesting. And also Jessica Benjamin, I would say, who's just, I mean, great on the idea of like the co-creation of the analytic experience, which is another way of talking about countertransference as far as I can see. In terms of the topic of transference itself, I mean, I think Lacan's seminar on transference is really fantastic, actually. And I mean, I think that's a place where the notion of transference is explored in a really, really fascinating detail in a post-Freudian context.
Yeah, so we come to the end of this talk. I thank you very much again, Professor Ellen, for being here with us. I thank very much the people who followed us at YouTube, and also the people who will listen to this talk later. Yeah, and have a good night, everyone. We will end the broadcasting right now.
Thank you very much.